Welcome to Podcast and Business. I am Juan Carlos Giraldo from Boston, United States. ESG, environmental, social, and governance frameworks are so important for business. And one of the fundamental pillars of these ESG metrics are ratings. Florian Berg is a researcher at the MIT Sloan School of Management. His research interests cover sustainable investing with a focus on ESG ratings, the disagreement between different rating agencies and how it affects investors, firms, and academic research. In this episode, I have as a guest Florian Berg. We discuss the concept of ESG ratings, how are they measured, how do these ratings benefit companies, and much more. This episode was recorded at the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Hello, Florian. How are you? It's a pleasure to have you today in my podcast and here in MIT. How are you?
I'm great, Juan Carlos. I'm happy that you could come.
Oh, no, certainly. Florian, ESG, environmental, social, and governance, is a very broad field of expertise, right? With many challenges ranging from the diversity, investment, and the impact of the environment that any kind of organization has. And even many of these companies are redesigning their business models to adjust themselves to these challenges. So, however, one of the pillars of ESG is the ratings. You are an expert in this field, in this topic. Well, this is why I invite you to discuss in this episode about ESG ratings. So I want to start this conversation with the following question, Florian, to understand the context. What is the definition of ESG ratings and why are they important for organizations?
To answer that, actually, I would like to go a step back a little bit. And ESG ratings started actually because of this massive capital inflows into sustainable finance. And that started roughly, I think there was an uptick in 2009, even though it has been around for a long time. Like investment funds, for example, that would divest from fossil fuels or other sectors. And so in 2009, there was really a massive uptick in sustainable finance, but this time it was about the companies that were the most sustainable companies and not just simply exclusion practices. And in the last, especially then again in the last 3-4 years around COVID, actually there was another massive increase of capital flowing into sustainable finance. Now we speak today of about $2.5 trillion worldwide invested into sustainable finance. And that actually creates then a demand for ESG ratings, because ESG ratings tell you how sustainable companies are. And if you're a portfolio manager and you want to run a portfolio, you need information of how you need to measure how sustainable companies are. And so they created this concept, what we call ESG rating now. So ESG ratings are environmental, social, and governance ratings. So the one part is environmental, which pertains to pollution, water usage, recycling practices, biodiversity, big topic at the moment. And then there's a social aspect, which refers, for example, to child labor in your supply chain. If you, for example, Nike in the 90s was faced with a massive corporate scandal because they produced their shoes in Asian countries where in the factories there were no good working conditions. So this is also a big part of how sustainable finance often defines sustainability. It's not only about the environmental aspect, but it's also about social aspects. And then you have human rights issues, labor practices, and also DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a very big topic today, and even one of the main topics in the whole field in terms of how often companies report about something. And then you also have governance, and governance is more about, for example, corruption, or if the company has a tax policy, if they try to sort of half legally and avoid taxes and not really paying the taxes that they have to. If they have a massive tax evasion scheme that might be legal but still very immoral, and might be also then a risk in the future in terms of reputation. If that comes out, then maybe consumers will say, oh no, this is actually a company that tried to avoid taxes, so I don't want to give them my money. So ESG ratings is really this measurement and this attempt of trying to measure how sustainable companies are.
So we know, Florian, that for these issues related to ESG ratings, there are many considerations related to these metrics that will allow us to evaluate the performance of each company. So my next question is, how can we identify if a company performs well, according to their ESG ratings? What will be a good ESG rating?
That is a great question. ESG ratings, as I mentioned, are about the overall sustainability of a company. So often, let me start a lot with criticism that I hear about ESG ratings. And often when you look at sustainable portfolios, some critiques say, oh, you have ExxonMobil or you have Shell in your portfolio, but that's a fossil fuel. Why would that ever be ESG? Or you have a tobacco company. Why would that ever be ESG? Because first of all, ESG is a broad concept. As I mentioned, it's about the environmental, social, and governance factors. So it's not only about environment. So that's why you might actually even have ExxonMobil or Shell or a tobacco company. It's also not necessarily about the product, because it's still a highly debated question. Should you include a tobacco company or not? Are the people that smoke maybe also responsible for choosing that product? And then would it be, but maybe it's interesting to how sustainable portfolio manager sees that they want to choose the best company compared to their peers, because they acknowledge, okay, tobacco is here and people want it. And fossil fuels is also, we're still relying on them. So it's not that we can just get rid of them. ESG ratings often or try to find out which company actually performs the best compared to their peers. Is, for example, ExxonMobil doing reasonable effort to increase their share of renewable energy in their research and development? The overall measurement, how you measure ESG in general, or how ESG raters measure ESG, is mostly through company disclosure. Companies put a lot of data nowadays online about the gender pay gap, about how much CO2 they emit, and this is actually then read by the ESG raters, and they have to interpret that data because it's coming from the companies, right? There could be reasons for greenwashing, right? Companies just say that they're doing really good, but they're actually not. And so this is the ESG rater that really has to interpret that data. This data often lacks context. For example, pollution, it might be actually or is more harmful if it's done upstream of a city than downstream. So that actually then also feeds into an ESG rating.
I would like to add, you mentioned a lot of industries, tobacco, etc., the companies who produce weapons.
Yeah, and actually this was actually starting with the war in Ukraine. This was a hot topic in the ESG world. Now, because Ukraine wanted to defend themselves, and then the question arose, are actually weapon manufacturers also social responsible?
That's the main point.
Yeah.
How you can, it's very difficult.
It's very, very difficult.
Very challenging,
Yeah, and it is very, very challenging. And that's why, it's hard to measure. But just because it's hard to measure doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't do it.
Oh, certainly not. Let's discuss an interesting paper you wrote with Julian Chelbel, I guess is his last name, and Roberto Rigobon here in MIT. The name is A Great Confusion, The Divergence of ESG Ratings. Was posted in August 2019, but was updated in April 2022. So the paper investigated divergence of environmental, social, and governance rating based on data from 6 very important agencies: KLD, Sustainalytics, Moody's, ESG, S&P Global, Refinitiv, and MSCCI. When I read the paper, an important part caught my attention was environmental, social, and governance ratings providers, which are the companies I am mentioning right now, have become influential institutions, which is right. You have the data that they provide, they analyze, etc., and then you start to work as a company. However, in the same paper, it says ESG ratings from different providers disagree substantially. So in the same times, these companies are doing a great job with this data that they have, providing to the companies what the ratings they have in certain kind of fields. But at the same time, all of them are completely different. So my question is, why, and it's all people who work in ESG, either way, communication, analytics, etc., have this question. Why are ESG ratings such a challenging task? Why is a challenging task, the ESG ratings, Florian?
Can I ask you a question, Juan Carlos? What do you think is more important? Is it DEI issues or climate change for Amazon?
Both.
Ha. Okay, so you would say 50-50.
50-50.
It's equal. I would say it's actually hard to answer, right? Because now I don't want to offend anyone.
Yeah.
I mean, we probably, if we now made that in a little bit of secret vote, we would probably come to different conclusions here. And so this is why it's so difficult to ask, because as I mentioned in these ESG ratings, there's so many different issues. And so then when you aggregate them to one single rating, to one single metric, you have to take into account so many different opinions about, or the ESG rater has to know which topic is the most important for which sector, or even for each company. Sometimes it happens even on the company level. Yeah, it's very challenging. I guarantee you, if you have 10 people and you have a secret vote, you will get 10 different answers.
Right, but there's no way to standardize something in the companies, like let's see, the range is going to be this, because some, for example, MSCI is laggard, positive, they have like the transit line, red, yellow, and green. So it's kind of easy, but in the same times, when you do your research and you post, let's see, Facebook, they say they laggard in, let's see, in transparency, but good in, diversity, etc. So there is a way to standardize these companies or regulate it, something like that?
Problem with standardization here is, as a regulator, you would need to know what the most important topic is. But it's a personal preference, right? As an investor. And so the regulator needs to measure the preferences of the investor. So it would be more interesting or more better if you have a lot of different ESG ratings, where each ESG rating expresses one view. And then the investors can actually buy those ESG ratings from the ESG raters and use them in the way they want to. So standardization, I don't think that is actually a good thing. But standardization has to happen on the level of company disclosure. Because when companies disclose CO2 data, we need to agree on how to count CO2 emissions. We need to agree on how to count the women on board or the gender pay gap, right? Because if we don't agree on that, then we will not even be able to interpret that data. So that's why there are disclosure frameworks that work similar than to accounting frameworks. And that is, for example, SASB or GRI or the newly formed ISSB. A lot of acronyms, and I'm sorry for dropping them. But I think when you really start in this field, the first thing is that you have to learn roughly probably 100 acronyms. And that takes a while. Yeah. So I think that this measurement of preferences is very complicated. And then there's another source of divergence that is even more important. And this is, we don't even know how to measure most of these things perfectly. Because what we truly want to measure when it comes to DEI is discrimination. How are actually historically disadvantaged groups treated in the workforce or in the company? We don't observe that, because if you really truly want to observe that, we would everyone give a recording device, and we would record any conversation within the company and even outside the company when people go for drinks, right? And we would read all the mails, and that would obviously create a lot of privacy problems. And that is another aspect actually of ESG. So you would go against another aspect of ESG. But so what we do is also, it's much cheaper just to look at the gender pay gap, because we just ask human resources, they deliver an Excel file and give me the gender pay gap. It's probably very easy nowadays in the human resource software to look up the gender pay gap, right? And then we count how many promotions women got over compared to men. But it's just still doesn't really get to this true discrimination. And so another aspect is that also this data is very hard to interpret. Gender pay gap can already hide a lot of different problems, because maybe some workers actually decide to only work part-time, and then obviously they will not progress as fast as others, right, in climbing up the corporate ladder. And so that is a big problem. And the other, let's look at sexual harassment cases. Sweden, when you look at the international ranking on most of the countries with the highest number of rapes cases. Sweden is number 3 worldwide. But you've been to Stockholm, you told me. It's fairly safe as a woman, right? It's probably one of the safest countries in the world because women are free to speak up and file complaints, go to the police, and they're heard actually when they report sexual harassment or a rape. And they also have a very broad definition of rape. And so that's why, and transposing that to firms, that means sometimes the worst offenders are those when there are no sexual harassment cases in the company. And when you have a sudden increase of sexual harassment cases in a company, it might actually just mean that the company is getting better because there's a push for transparency. And women are now allowed to speak up and they're heard. And so this would be then an improvement in terms of discrimination performance. And all that is so difficult to measure. When it comes to CO2 emissions, right, what you really want to know as an ESG rater is if that companies reduce their CO2 emissions at a certain pace in the future. And how much do you trust if they say they do that, right? A lot of companies, they put targets on. But then we see actually that they often don't really follow up on those targets. And so this is something that an ESG rater should also give his opinion about. And this makes it extremely hard and challenging to measure ESG ratings. But what is actually interesting, we did a lot of research on because there's so much measurement noise, as I said, is there actually a signal in the ESG ratings? And we do consistently find a signal in those ESG ratings. And it's, again, as I said that before, just because we don't know how to measure something perfectly, we still want to measure it, right? There are plenty of things that we don't measure perfectly when we go to the doctor, right? You worked in the pharmaceutical sector, but we still want the doctor to have an opinion about it, and we still want
a second opinion.
Yeah, exactly, and a third opinion, right? Hence the 3-4 raters maybe that often also big asset managers buy. They often don't rely on one ESG rater, but they rely on 3-4 ESG raters.
There's a very good article in Financial Times that you wrote with your colleagues as well, rating the agency ratings. So the question is just come up, is rating ESG rating agencies the solution for this task?
That would be...
tricky.
It's absolutely tricky. I don't know how to do that. There's a big reason. So let's get a little bit technical here. I think one big problem that ESG ratings have is they're called ESG rating, and then often people compare them to credit risk rating. And you've heard of credit risk rating, right? This AAA rating, for example, a lot of countries have, given from S&P Global or Moody's or Fitch. And that basically tells you the risk of bankruptcy of the country or the firm. Credit risk ratings are very different because credit risk ratings, they only measure one concept. And that concept is risk of default, risk of bankruptcy, or the loss associated to that bankruptcy. And so you observe every month or every day, actually, you observe if a company goes bankrupt or not. So you can actually fine-tune your methodology because you always know if it was true or not. And that's why also a lot of those ratings, those credit risk ratings, they're basically the same from different providers. So S&P Global will give a very similar rating than Moody's and then Fitch. With ESG rating, it's completely different because ESG ratings, they measure so many different concepts. And then they measure them also, you can't really fine-tune them because you observe the gender pay gap. But tomorrow you will maybe observe another gender pay gap because they will update it, this company, but you don't really know the true discrimination performance. So there's no way how you can naturally fine-tune your methodology. It has to be certain conviction. You have to say, okay, academia, for example, says this is a good way of measuring discrimination. We tried, for example, really interesting, we had a research project a couple of years ago here with the Media Lab. And the Media Lab here at MIT are all these crazy inventors. If you have a crazy idea, you always have to go there. And there's always someone ready to work on it. And so we wanted to get to this true discrimination performance. And we said gender pay gap might not be a good idea because there's a lot of bias in there. And sexual harassment cases is also hard to interpret. So the best thing would be to measure actually conversations, what I already mentioned with sensors. And here, what we actually want in this literature that we followed, the academic literature, it kind of emerged a consensus that women often speak to create harmony and men speak to dominate. So if a man is interrupted, he just re-interrupts and then they're fighting up. When you interrupt a woman, she stops speaking, and because she wants to keep this harmony. And so obviously this is a very generalization, right? So we did the study and thought, this is a great way of measuring discrimination. We did it on a sample, and that was the MBA students here at MIT. Turns out that women interrupted men more than the other way. But that was certainly a sample selection bias. But this was actually an effort from us to really try to figure out this true discrimination performance, right? And I think that what the solution here is to make ESG ratings better is exactly that. Like, leveraging everything we have, right? Machine learning, artificial intelligence, and there's so many innovations happening in that space, so that I think in the future this measurement will become better. Trying just find ways to measure each indicator better. But there's so many different issues, as I said, right? Some raters have up to 282 different issues that they look at, where we still have to put a lot of effort, and we will put a lot of effort because there's so much interest in this. But let's also not forget that it's such a new field. Financial accounting has been around for 100 years, right? But sustainability accounting, not so long. And so we still have to work. And I would argue that sustainability accounting is much more complex than financial accounting. And so to get it right, we still need a long time.
More education, more communication, all the things that we are doing right now.
Exactly.
In my most recent episode, I talked with a colleague in the financial sector in Switzerland about transparency and sustainable finance, and how it's essential to identify as stakeholders or shareholders what companies are doing a good job related to ESG. So if we put aside armament, alcohol, tobacco, and all the companies that we just mentioned, right? Gambling, etc. on the side. In your opinion, what industries have more challenge in measuring ESG?
I think it's not necessarily an industry, but it's companies that rely on a big supply chain. Because you also have to take into account the supply chain. And for example, if you look at an American company that entirely has its production somewhere in a less transparent. For example, if you look at a company that has its entire supply chain or its entire production in a country that is less transparent, such as somewhere in Asia, then you actually really struggle to figure out what the overall sustainability performance of those company is. It's easier to measure it here where we have a lot of transparency there. For example, we have stakeholders that create transparency here, the companies themselves, by putting out statements. Then you have some certain legislation. For example, the EPA will ask them to report all the toxic releases of pollution. You have also other indicators that they have to, or like in California now, you have to publish your CO2 emissions. And so this happens here. And then you have the media, obviously. There will also, soon there's a corporate scandal, you will read it somewhere in the media. The problem, if it's then in a smaller country in Asia, the same scandal in the supply chain will maybe never make it to an international news outlet. And so the analyst here in an ESG rater will never be able to read it because it was written in a language that he doesn't speak. And so only the biggest scandals then make it actually up to the English-speaking news outlets. And I think this is really the main problem, measuring what's happening actually in the supply chain. And I think that's also one of the most important things of ESG, sustainable finance, because sustainable finance make actually, through putting pressure on those big companies here, for example, Apple that produces a lot in China through Foxconn. If you put pressure on Apple here, then they actually will put pressure on Foxconn in China to improve labor practices there. And so this is how you actually, because the government here cannot obviously legislate in China, so they cannot improve working conditions by laws, but we can do that in an indirect way.
Yes, it's a very challenging topic, this all the ESG rating. Florian, is there anything that you would like to add to this conversation related to ESG ratings?
I would like to add something about the measurement, because measurement is also more complicated because of those ESG raters. They want to measure a lot of companies, and we're talking often about 15,000 companies that they have to rate, and in different cultures. And that also is a big problem because issues in the US are not necessarily the same in Europe and certainly not the same in China or in India or Latin America. And you see that actually in the beginning, and still sometimes you see that there are sometimes problems. For example, a prominent American rater would ask German companies to report on race in the workforce in Germany. And me, as a German, that makes me shiver just to hear the word race. And it's absolutely forbidden in Germany to have even records of race of people. And for a good reason, for a very, very good reason. But here in the US, it's interpreted in a different way because you want to have something like positive discrimination. So the intention here is good. But so asking then German companies to report on that and punishing them for not reporting on that is a problem. So you always have to take into account the local context. And I get lots of calls in the recent years from, for example, from Thailand, from the Thai stock market, and from other institutions where they say, yeah, our Thai companies, they always get bad ratings, but they just misunderstand them. I look at the methodology and they get punished for reasons that they shouldn't. And so one of the first countries that actually created legislation on ESG ratings is India, and that came out 3-4 months ago. So in the summer 2023. And they actually explicitly ask for certain indicators to be taken into account, such as rural development. Rural development is not as a big issue in Germany, for example, that's very decentralized, or in the US, than in India, where you really have this divide between rich cities and poor countryside. And so this is something that adds to the challenge, to this really immense challenge of making ESG ratings better.
Florian, where people can contact you? I watched some of your webinars, very good ones. I listened to podcasts where you were part of. Your papers are really, really good and easy to read. They are not difficult to read, I'm no expert in ESG ratings, but I read it and I totally get them. Where people can contact you?
Thank you. That was a very big compliment because I really try to bridge this gap between people that are in academia and people that are not in academia. And that makes it actually sometimes really hard. But I'm really happy to hear that, to read. I think the best is going to my website, florianberg.io. There are a lot of my talks. If they're recorded, I put them on my website. I also sometimes write on my blog there about ideas. But and then I write sometimes in the media. There's, for example, an op-ed as you mentioned, in the Financial Times or in the Wall Street Journal. I had a big op-ed. If you're still interested and you have questions, then just reach out to my mail address that you find on my website, florianberg.io.
Florian, thank you for all your insights. It was a pleasure to have this conversation here at MIT. I think it's crucial for all professionals who are dedicated to work in this field of ESG. Share this kind of information is crucial, and to understand more and more what are the goals of the ESG ratings or ESG in general. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. It was really fun, and thank you for helping me to share this.
Anytime. I'm Juan Carlos Giraldo from Boston. I am recording right now at MIT. Thank you so much, everyone.